Today we are making honey oat wheat bread. I think you can put it in any variation of that, but that is what the recipe said. Once again, this is from my mom. She did get it from online, but I don't know where she got it from. She wrote it down for me and gave me the recipe, so that's what I'm going to be following. I'm just gathering my ingredients here. The first thing we're doing is warming up water. Once again, we want it warm, we don't want it hot. And then I'm also turning the oven on to 350 degrees. And then I'm going to measure out my milk, put it in a pot and put my honey in there as well, and then warm it up to the optimal temperature for yeast to thrive, which is 120 to 120 degrees Fahrenheit. So that is what I'm going to be doing here. This recipe is really good because it has a lot of good kind of healthier things in it. So it's made with wheat flour as well as whole purpose flour or all purpose flour, but it's also sweetened with honey. I have substituted the butter for non-dairy butter as well as with oil. So you can make those adjustments if need be. And it tastes just as good. And sometimes even better if you can find the correct oil. I really like avocado oil for making bread. Something about it just makes the bread nice and moist, and the texture is really good. Today I did not have any avocado oil, so I'm using butter, and I'm also using coconut oil to line my pans and my bowl with. Coconut oil, in my experience, makes a denser loaf or a denser roll. So I typically will use, if I'm going to use coconut oil to substitute, I'm going to use just a little bit less, just like a tiny bit less. I went ahead and put my rolled oats into my mixing bowl, and then later you're going to see me dumping the warm to hot milk over the oats, and that's what's going to cook the oats just a little bit, just to soften them up. Here I am dumping my whole wheat flour all over everywhere, apparently, into my whole wheat flour bin. I just gotten a new one. I haven't actually made this bread in a little while. It's a little bit more involved. Here we are dumping the hot-ish milk. It's not warm. I would say that it's hot. As you can see, it's steaming, but I want it to be hot because I want it to soften up the oats just a little bit. As you can see, it says add milk and let stand for a few minutes. So I'm going to let it stand. I believe it was about 10 to 15 minutes. It really just depends on how warm the milk is, because then I'm going to wait for it to become the optimum temperature for my yeast. I am not going to add my yeast until it's the right temperature, or I will kill it. If I add my yeast to hot water, anything really above 125, so you see it's right at the right temperature, so I'm adding my yeast. If I add my yeast to hot water, it will kill it and it will not rise, and the bread will be really flat and not like spongy bread like you want. So making sure that it's at the right temperature is a really important step to get the type of rise and type of loaf that you wanted. And I sped this up, I think, 800 times so that you guys could see the activation of the yeast happening, because I just thought it was fascinating. So I let this sit for about 10 minutes. The butter in here, I think, slowed down the process of the yeast activating. So I used to add it to the milk combination. So you can do it a couple different ways, but that's the way that I did it this time. Checking the temperature of my water, because it does call for a half of a cup of warm water. And then I'm adding my salt. Keep in mind, salt and yeast don't really love each other. So make sure that you get the activation of your yeast happened before you add your salt, because the salt will interrupt that a little bit. Now I'm adding my whole wheat flour. This recipe calls for 2.5 cups of whole wheat flour. I thought about just eyeballing the half cup, but decided against it. And now I'm going to show you this process because when I'm watching a recipe being made, it helps me to see the texture within the bowl. So I'm showing you that here. So I'm just adding flour, and I believe it calls for 2 to 2.5 cups of all-purpose flour. I add the first 1.5 cups or so, and then I add it slowly just to get the texture that I'm looking for. And with this particular recipe, it's pretty sticky but gets dense really fast. So I add it very slowly. I probably add it by a couple tablespoons at a time just to ensure that I don't add too much, because it really makes the loaf a bit dense if I add even a little bit too much. So I chose this time to go with the more sticky dough and then add the flour to the kneading process, and that worked out pretty well. And next time I will probably even add a little bit less flour, because my bread loaves at the end were just a little bit denser than I would like. Although this loaf is going to be a bit denser with it being a whole wheat and an oat, having oats in it as well. It's going to be a little bit more dense and a little bit more heavy. So just keep that in mind if and when you are making this recipe. So I'm adding just a touch more, and I'm also going to add a pretty healthy amount of flour to my surface, which is the counter. In this particular situation is just the counter with flour on it. I am going to incorporate quite a bit of that flour into my loaf, although you will see me actually take some of that flour away, because as I am mixing it, as I'm kneading it, it gets just a little bit too hard, too dense. So I made the decision not to add any more. Just keep in mind that if you have made my other recipe, the Rogers basic white bread recipe, this dough is going to feel quite a bit different because of the different ingredients. Now you might be thinking, well, yes, obviously, but I don't want you to have made that recipe and then coming to this one and kind of panicking because the dough itself feels quite a bit different. That is okay. That is the way that it is supposed to be. So here I'm just dumping it out onto my floured surface. And before I wash my hands off, I am getting all of the flour around so that it doesn't stick to my hands as much. And do you see how much flour I'm getting into my dough ball? So I'm saying, okay, no, that's too much. If I continue to mix all of this flour in, it's going to really drastically change the texture of my dough at the end as well as right now. And then I'm just dumping a little bit of coconut oil on the top, just enough to cover the surface. You don't want to have like a layer of coconut oil, like, a really thick layer. It's just enough to keep the top of your dough ball moist while it is doing the rising process or the proofing process. Otherwise, it'll dry out and get kind of a hard, funny rubbery crust, and you don't want that. So this is it right before it starts its first rise. If you don't cover it with something or you don't oil the top, it'll get that funny kind of rubbery texture on the top, and then when you go to do the next step, that won't go away, and so you'll have like hard parts and funny textured parts in your loaf, and you don't want that. So this particular dough I cover with cling wrap as well as a towel, because with it being a little bit of a denser dough, it needs to maintain that warmth just a little bit more in order for it to really activate. I have found that works better for me in my kitchen, in my altitude, all of the things. So I just keep doing it. It doesn't call for it necessarily, but that's just something that I have discovered works really well for me with this particular dough. Cleaning up the bowl right away is, I'm not going to say it's important because it's obviously up to you, but it makes it a lot easier because it doesn't harden on and just become glue. So here it is just a couple minutes later, and it's starting to rise really nicely. And then this is an hour later, so it calls for a 60-minute rise or proof. So it's been hanging out on the nice warm stove top. I've had my oven on the whole time to 350 degrees. And I have found that works perfectly for rising bread right there on the top with a little pad right in between, so it's not directly sitting on the top. So it's all puffed up with air. I am going to hit all that air out, get all the air out. I have floured the surface again, but not too heavily, just enough to make it so that it does not stick. I'm cutting it in half. You can be very specific and get your food scale out if you would like, and measure exactly how much goes into each loaf. I don't do that. And mine turn out okay. Is one of my loaves bigger than the other? Sure, but I'm okay with that. So here I just flatten it all out, get as much of the air out as I can, and then start folding it into itself. And my goal is to not only get it into a loaf type shape, but also to have a nice, as smooth as I can, top on it. Granted, this has oats in it, so it's not going to be completely smooth, as you are going to see. See how you see the bumps on there? Those are the oats kind of popping out, and that's totally okay. That is what you want. I'm going to do this oil trick again, and I'm just kind of putting it on like lotion on my hands, and then I'm just kind of patting the top of my loaf to get the oil on the surface of the loaf. And here we go again. We're just going to do the process all over again, aside from the fact that now they are in the loaf pan, which they are going to go into the oven in, and they are in the shape that I am going to cook them in. So I'm just covering them with the saran wrap again. I did not cover them with a towel this time. So this is what they look like when they first go on. This is about 20 minutes later. You can see that they're really starting to puff up and look really nice. I'm looking for them to be about an inch above the side of the pan, which mine were probably more than that when I put them in. Keep in mind that if you're using multiple loaf pans, so if you were to split this into 3 or 4 different loaf pans, it's not going to rise as much. So do keep that in mind. You're looking for it to double, maybe triple in size before you put it in the oven. Now this recipe browns really quickly, and so I always try to fight that by putting tinfoil on the top of it. So this is what it looks like after it's been cooling for about 20 minutes, so it's still warm. All right, there we have it. Sorry I was on a call when I took it out of the oven, or I would have shown you that process, but I just brought them out of the tins. So out of the tins, and I dumped them out onto this cooling rack and just put them here with this little tent over it like that so that the flies won't land on it as it's cooling. And I'm gonna let them cool down completely before I put them in bags. I have the big Ziploc bags that work really well for this. I will try to remember to link them down below. I did forget on the other video, but I'll try to remember to link them down below. We are probably going to eat one of these today, and then this one will be waiting for us in the following days. Homemade bread in my house goes pretty quickly. All of the kids really enjoy it, and then I also give it away as well. So homemade bread does not stay around very long, but this is the final product. It smells delicious, and I'm sure the kids are very much looking forward to eating this. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I hope that you will be back for more. I am realizing that I'm really enjoying making these kitchen videos while it's turning seasons and there's not much to do in the garden. So I'm really enjoying making all of my favorite things with you guys and sharing with you guys the recipes, and I really hope that they can become staples in your home as well as trying new things like the pumpkin cinnamon rolls and the butterfly cake that you guys are going to be seeing probably before this video. So I'm really happy to have you guys here, and I hope that you enjoy. So here we are ready to cut into it. It is probably warm at this point. It's not completely cool, but it's not hot either. It's probably been about 30 to 45 minutes since it's come out of the oven. It looks beautiful. It is not perfect by any means, but in my opinion, it doesn't need to be in order to be edible. And I'm very grateful to have a husband that agrees. Like sometimes mine will look terrible and I will be lamenting about it, and he said, it doesn't matter how it looks, does it taste good? And he always says yes. So you can see the texture is nice and moist. It is more dense, but that is okay. And it tasted very delicious, very flavorful. And here I'm just going to be cutting some up for the kids' snack. And we all thought it was absolutely delicious. Everybody has a different preference for what they want on top of it, which you guys will be seeing next time. And as you can see, this would be really good for a sandwich. Granted, if I was doing a sandwich, I wouldn't cut them quite as thick. But that's the nice thing about this bread too, is that it does allow for thinner slices based on the texture of the loaf. And as always, I wish there was smell-o-vision, because the way that a house smells when there's fresh bread being baked, and the way that just it smells in general, is just so delicious. So we had requests for 2 of them to be honey with butter or butter with honey, 1 with just honey, and then I did on mine, I did cream cheese and raspberry jam, which is the best. So good. I don't really discriminate what I have on my bread. I have very recently introduced bread back into my diet, and I'm trying not to go just completely overboard with it and just eat the entire loaf. So it's very special. I don't take for granted the fact that I am able to enjoy fresh homemade bread that I made. It is something that I hold a lot of gratitude for, and I'm very thankful for the healing to be able to do so. Cream cheese with raspberry jam is one of my mom's favorites, so it always kind of makes me nostalgic of her. She'll put cream cheese and raspberry jam on just about anything. It was so good. It was so good. And now we're just packaging it up. So we've eaten some, and now I don't want it to go stale or go hard, so I'm putting it in these nice big Ziploc bags. Also, dance parties, welcome. We were listening to music and dancing around. I hope you have a wonderful day.